Hi class, I can't make it today because of the rain, so I thought I'd try to make a video and share a little bit of my research and what I discovered. I researched the practices of adoption in the ancient Near East and how they relate to what Abraham said about Eliezer in Genesis 15:2 and 3. I was partly interested in that because my wife and I are in the process of adopting right now through foster care, and I was just wondering what did they do back then. A big thing I found was that the practices that the ancient world used to deal with not having a child was a lot different from the practices today. Even adoption was a lot different, and that was what specifically I looked at. One big issue in comparing what Abraham says in Genesis 15 with adoption practices is we don't actually know what he says. I'll read from the ESV. It says, "But Abraham said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." Well, this heir of my house idea is the Hebrew word ben meshech, and there actually is not really a clear understanding of what meshech is. And so there's been a number of proposals of how to interpret it. Maybe ben meshech is a gloss, or it's usually translated Damascus, Damasek, or Damesek, excuse me. So there are a few different options in what this ben meshech could mean. One proposal is that the word meshech has to do with a verb that is related to the idea of assault or rushing. So Eliezer is a usurper or an unwanted successor. And so then the text says he's from Damascus because historically Damascus was one of Israel's enemies. A second solution is the idea that ben meshech is somehow related to Damascus. And in that proposal, it's an equivalent, and it could either be that this idea of him being ben meshech is actually he's just a person from Damascus, or one proposal is that he's actually a wealthy man from Damascus, and Abraham is taking out a loan with this man from Damascus. In another proposal, the idea of Damesek has nothing to do with the city of Damascus because the dalet, the D sound, is the Aramaic relative pronoun. So in that case, meshech is actually the word and not Damesek, and so it has to do with the Hebrew word for cupbearer, and so the indication then is that Eliezer is Abram's cupbearer, or servant. So essentially the three positions are that either Eliezer is a usurper, secondly, he could be someone from Damascus who's not part of Abraham's household at all, and that idea of him being from the household is actually a technical term that he's the heir. And the third possibility is that Eliezer is not from Damascus, but is a member of Abram's household as a servant. So the last two options involve very different kinds of adoption. So the one would involve, if he's part of the household and he's a servant, just a regular adoption that we'd think of. And the other one would involve a practice known as sale adoption, where a person would take out a loan from somebody wealthy, and so they would adopt them. They would give them the inheritance rights to their property in exchange for that person giving them supplies or food now. And that practice is attested to throughout the ancient world. So my main research was involved in looking at adoption in the ancient Near East, and it did involve both of those kinds of adoption. It's important to know that for us, we think of adoption as a familial thing. They were thinking about it more of the legal side. And of course, that's partly because what's preserved are the legal documents. And there are many, many legal documents throughout the ancient world that preserve accounts of adoption, just the actual contract of what would happen. So there would be a contract between the parent and the child saying the parent is going to leave you this property, the child is responsible for taking care of the parent in their old age, and respecting them and revering them. There was also an element when they died, they had to do the various religious rituals unique to the culture that were expected of children. So I did research in the Old Babylonian period, which was fairly interesting. That would be closer to the time of when Abraham is traditionally expected to have come out of Ur. There's some evidence in the Old Assyrian period. There's one adoption contract surviving, but there are also accounts of adoptions, just stories that are surviving on different tablets. There's a little bit of evidence from the Kassite period in Babylon, which is 16th to 12th century BC, and a little from the same period in Assyria. The most significant information on adoption we have is from the archaeological site with the town of Nuzi, which is near modern Kirkuk in Iraq, and that was a part of the kingdom of Arapa, which was between Babylon and Assyria. It's pretty close to Ashur, and there was quite a bit of adoption evidence there, and a lot of it had to do with this practice of sale adoption or real estate adoption. What would happen is they had land that they were not sure exactly how the system worked, but they think that the land was not able to be transferred through a normal sale. There was probably some kind of tax system or feudal system that prevented the land from being transferred. And so the current landowner, if they were short on money or food, would have to adopt somebody, legally adopt them. And it had very little to do with actual adoption. So if I was running out of food and I needed, I had some land in my family, I could adopt a random person who's wealthy. They would have immediate access to the property. They would be my heir technically, but they would have immediate access to the property, and then they would give me some food. Or for an example, one of the things that someone received was 1 cow, 9 minas of tin, some number of sheep we can't tell from the tablet condition, 2 goats, and 15 homers of barley. So that's their immediate need of food being met. One of the most interesting situations is about a family there whose the father of the family died, and so his widow and their 2 sons were left. And so that widow and one of her sons, the older son, they adopted a man named Enamati, and they received a bunch of supplies from him. Then later on, the widow alone adopted Enamati, and then later on, the widow and her 2 sons, all 3 acted as parents for Enamati. So he probably was a wealthy man, and as they were running out of food, they were borrowing from him. There are other contracts demonstrating that they borrowed money from him, and then ultimately they ended up adopting him all these different times, and each time they would give him the deed to a different piece of property. One of the strongest differences between the adoption contracts and the sale adoption contracts is the sale adoption contracts would specify what property the adoptee would inherit, and the regular adoption contracts would say the adoptee would have a share in the general inheritance. Also, the sale adoption contracts did not require any ongoing reverence for the parents, whereas a true adoption, the child was expected to revere the parent. And then the child was expected to participate in any religious rituals in a number of the cultures, which gives us a hint that perhaps if that's what was going on with Abraham and Eliezer, that Eliezer would be expected to become a follower of Yahweh also. The late Hittite documents are very unhelpful in this discussion of adoption. Interestingly, the Hittite documents did not have very much information at all about family law, and particularly with adoption. And in Egypt, there is one reference to adoption in the Egyptian documents. It's a very complicated scenario that happens, which leads us to believe that there were frequently adoptions there, but there are no surviving documents. One theory is that that's just because the documents are on papyrus, and so they broke down and we don't have them. There's quite a bit of evidence in the Neo-Babylonian period, and one of the interesting things is there's no formulas for adoption in the Bible, although it does seem to be a practice that was done based on the fact that we've got Moses being raised by Pharaoh's daughter, which seems like adoption somewhat, and then in Proverbs there's a statement that says, "A servant who deals wisely will rule over a son who acts shamefully and will share the inheritance as one of the brothers." So it is possible for a servant to serve as a family member. It's not clear if that was a formalized situation or not. So after I did all this research, I determined that I do not think that Eliezer could have been involved in one of these sale adoption scenarios with Abraham. They always involved physical property, and Abraham never owned any physical property except for the cave, and he didn't own it yet. Also, the fact that Eliezer is not present when Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham indicates that he never was made a formal heir, so there was never a contract of adoption, which is a common element in ancient Near Eastern cultures. It's possible that Abraham intended to form that sort of relationship, but just hadn't done it yet when he's talking in Genesis 15. And it is possible that he could have still given him everything that he owned just because he's the head of the household without ever forming a legal arrangement. So that was the conclusion of my research. It was very interesting and so much to learn about that I was surprised by how much information there was about adoption in all these cultures.